Welcome to this PowerPoint presentation summarizing again the highlights from Chapter 5. We continue to bounce around a little bit in the book, and so we're now looking at Chapter 5 in this module. We're going to look at diagnosis, etc., meaning we're going to go to Chapters 4 and 7 after this module, and so just keep up in terms of which chapter we're in. This is actually the highlights from Chapter 5, which attempts to look at what do we know about the causes of alcohol use disorders. We're going to take a look at what defines or what allows us to diagnose alcohol use disorders, but this chapter actually is focused on what do we currently understand about, quote, the causes of alcohol use disorders. Part of what you're going to see as you both look at the chapter, read the chapter, go through the materials in the module is that we have a pretty good sense of some of the things that correlate with the development of alcohol use disorders and other substance use disorders, but at the moment we don't have specific causal effects in terms of alcohol use disorders. But keep that in mind. Again, remember that this presentation highlights what is contained in the chapter. It is not intended to be a substitute for reading the chapter. The book starts out by taking a look at alcohol use disorders from this public health perspective, or what they call the public health model. And so as we get into that, the public health model basically takes a look at conditions, at illnesses, at diseases, at problems, and looks at them from multiple perspectives, one being the perspective of the agent or the substance itself in our case. So one of them is, what do we know about alcohol? We've looked a little bit at that already. In addition to looking at, quote, the agent, we also then have to look at the individual who is affected, i.e. the host. And as you're going to see in this chapter, we're going to look at the host from, quote, a genetic perspective. What do we know about background that perhaps contributes or influences the development or the presence of alcohol use disorders? And then we're also going to look at the host from a non-biologic, but from a personality and the psychological makeup, a temperament perspective, because there is some sense that in order to understand the development of substance use disorders, there are both genetic factors as well as personality, temperament, psychological factors. And then the third perspective that the public health model takes is, in addition to looking at agent and host, we then have to take a look at and what is it about their environment, environmental, sociological factors that also contribute or in some cases protect the development of alcohol use disorders. So keep this in mind as a big presence or as a big organizer for the information here. This slide simply highlights comments that were made on the previous slide. This public health model, again, is a well-known and systematic way of analyzing and dealing with conditions, with health conditions, with diseases, with illnesses, etc. In recent years, you've seen it in other areas of your life as well. I mean, we have things like the Zika virus, we have things like West Nile disease, certainly attention being paid to illnesses and conditions like medically resistant infections, HIV infections. So you're familiar with this model, just perhaps have never thought about alcohol use disorders from this perspective. And again, the analysis is based upon an analysis of the agent itself, in our case, what causes the condition or the disease, alcohol, the host, the individuals who are experiencing the condition or the disease, and then lastly, the environment. Where is it that the person contracted or came down with this infection or this disease? We've looked already at alcohol in general, and again, we looked at in chapters 4 and chapters 3 and chapter 6. We looked at both the acute and then the chronic effects of alcohol consumption. As we looked at chapter 13, other drugs of abuse, we then became introduced to the various categories or classification systems for substances, for mood-altering substances. And so this is really part of what we know about alcohol as, quote, the agent from a public health perspective. We do know that it's a central nervous system depressant, and therefore when the person uses it, he or she experiences effects due to how it interacts with the central nervous system. We also know that for most individuals at lesser levels of consumption, mild levels of intoxication, the user experiences some pretty immediate and pretty potentially gratifying feelings of relaxation. People enjoy the effects of alcohol. We do know that from a consumption perspective, it then tends to make people, even though it's a central nervous system depressant, it increases psychomotor activity. And we do know that for people who continue to use alcohol, that alcohol does have a high abuse potential. Individuals who use the substance that are likely to continue to use the substance, and if the substance has mood-altering psychoactive properties, ultimately, if they begin to experience loss of control, then we say that that substance has a high abuse potential. It also has rapid onset, it has pleasurable effects, and so people who use alcohol are really likely to continue to use alcohol. Continuing to take a look at alcohol itself, we do really know that that from a properties perspective, it is predictable. It's pretty short term. People experience the effects pretty quickly upon using, and it's obviously something that can be obtained pretty readily, pretty easily. You can deliver it to your system. You consume it pretty rapidly, and the effects will persist for some time. So there's some positive effects about alcohol consumption as an agent that make it likely that people are going to continue to use the substance. The last bullet point, by the way, on this slide is a little bit misleading because what they're actually referring to is the fact that when the desired effects of a substance fade rapidly, then there's a desire to readminister the substance. So that last fade, rapid fading of the desired effects fade, I think is redundant. I'm not quite sure why they put it there, so don't get caught up in that. What they're really referring to here is that the desired effects of alcohol are diminished pretty rapidly. An ongoing debate in terms of the development or the presence of substance use disorders is trying to determine is it genetic, i.e., does it occur specifically because of on a biologic basis, or is it environmental, i.e., nature, genetic, nurture, environmental. And what you're going to see here is that there's support for the influence of both a natural or a biologic, a genetic component. There's also recognition that there appear to be some environmental components as well, and so it does not appear to be, quote, an either-or perspective. What we do know is that, just like many other conditions, that when there is a family history of substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders, etc., then individuals who are born into families with a history of substance use disorders are at greater risk for developing substance use disorders themselves. But it's not a one-to-one correlation. So if you have one parent, one biologic parent with a substance use disorder, you're at greater risk of having a substance use disorder yourself. If you have two biologic parents with substance use disorders, then you're at even increased risk of developing a substance use disorder yourself. But one or two biologic parents with substance use disorders does not, quote, guarantee, does not cause the specific development or the guaranteed development of a substance use disorder. And so we know that nature plays a role, but separating the environmental and the non-natural impact from the natural, the genetic, biologic impact is challenging and complex. We've tried to look at that in a number of different ways that are looked at in this chapter. Whenever you have the ability to compare twins, especially obviously individuals who are genetic, identical twins who are identically genetically, and then also individuals who are born in an environment that in which they're separated from their biologic parents. So looking at adopted children in particular, individuals who are adopted as children, and their genetic history and how that plays out over the course of a lifetime, there again is some correlation that the biologic, the genetic factors, the hereditary factors do increase the odds of substance use disorders, but they don't guarantee or, quote, dictate that the person will develop a substance use disorder, i.e. alcohol dependence, even when there's a strong genetic component to that. And then also, similarly, if they're raised in environments that are either heavy alcohol or non-alcoholic attitudes and perspectives. There is some influence, but again, it's not a guaranteed influence, and so there is an interaction between the genetic and the environmental, the biologic and the environmental, the nature and nurture thing. As noted on this slide as well, if you look at individuals who are half-sibs, i.e. Share one common parent and then different parents on some level, that if they have, for those half-siblings, when the parent who has a substance use disorder is, quote, the common parent, then if they have a genetic background that's positive for substance use disorder, then they are at more risk or more likely to develop substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders as an adult as well. Once there was agreement or acceptance of the fact that there appeared to be a genetic factor that contributes to the development of alcohol use disorders, and the next step in the study was to try to figure out, so what is it, what's the nature of this genetic predisposition? They do a nice job in the book in kind of walking through the material that's presented here, because the attempt is to try to determine if there are differences, what are those? And in particular, are the differences related to the person's response to a single dose of alcohol? Does that response make a person more or less likely to develop a substance use disorder? And as you'll see in the book, what seemed to emerge from that study is that individuals who have a lesser response to a single dose of alcohol are usually individuals who are coming from an alcohol-dependent family member. So the short story is that if you have a family history of alcohol dependence, then they tend to have a diminished response. They don't feel as high or as intoxicated as people who have no family history of dependence. And so correlation or an indication, but unsure exactly how that contributes to the development of an alcohol use disorder. The book goes on to explain that this difference did appear to have sort of long-term impact on people's likelihood of developing a problem in response to their consumption of alcohol. If a person had that reduced response to alcohol, in general, they were 4 times more likely to become alcohol dependent as individuals who had a non-diminished or a more sensitive response to alcohol. So in this case, it's the alcohol dose response, a lesser response increases the likelihood that the person is going to go on to become, to develop an alcohol use disorder, to become alcohol dependent. The book continues to look at other aspects of responses to alcohol. They do a nice job describing the changes in the brain measured by EEG. For people who have a family history of alcohol dependence, they typically experience greater relaxation with a single dose of alcohol than those without such a family background. So take a look at the discussion of these differences, the remaining differences there as they're described on pages 111 and 112 in the chapter. They also do a nice job of talking about attempts to identify genetic markers, which means if we had the ability to identify a specific gene that was responsible for the development or the riskiness of substance use disorders, then in theory we could target that gene. We could look at gene therapy or attempts to, to quote, modify the genes in order to strengthen the non-alcohol, non-substance use disorder response, make it more resistant, etc. So the hope was that, or the thought was that perhaps it was a single gene that could be identified. You'll see that at this point there are multiple genes that have been correlated or identified as correlating with the development of substance use disorder, and so we really are no longer thinking that there's going to be, quote, a simple response, which doesn't mean the research won't continue. It just means that it's a complicated issue, and so there are no simple solutions out there. The book does a nice job talking a little bit about attempts to glean insight based on animal studies, since it would be unethical to study humans and expose them to alcohol and other mood-altering substances on an experimental basis. And so a lot of what we gain is based upon attempts to both research in other animals and then draw parallels from their experience to human experiences as well. So take a look at that. As the chapter continues to take a look at what we have learned from studies that have been conducted on humans, and in particular, a couple things. Look at some variations or variances on a gene called the D2 gene that is associated with brain receptors for dopamine receptors. Dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that really affects the brain itself and the pleasure centers of the brain. We'll be talking a bit more about it. So they talk about how this gene somehow impacts how alcohol is metabolized, and specifically talk about a couple of variants that can be found on the gene, alleles that are called either A1 or A2. What researchers found is that for individuals who had this A1 allele or this A1 variant, 69% of the people who had alcohol use disorders, severe alcohol use disorders, had this A1 allele, whereas 20% of the people without dependence had that version. So the extension is that somehow the presence of this A1 allele increases the likelihood of susceptibility to alcohol use disorder, ultimately sort of leading up to a higher level of analysis, which is that somehow risk factors, likelihood of developing substance use disorders, go back to the impact of substances on the brain and really kind of the balance, the reward system, the ability of the brain and the susceptibility of the brain in terms of natural, biologic, biochemical, chemical rewards, things like that. As you read the chapter and listen to this narration, there's a pretty detailed account of this that is contained on pages 114 and 115 with about a one paragraph sort of excerpt right in the middle of page 115 that I think gives you good insight into what the researchers have found and how it's been interpreted. So you may not want to be a genetic researcher, but if we're going to understand what causes alcohol use disorders and other substance use disorders, it's important to know what we're learning and where the research appears to be headed at this point. The other question that is raised by some of this research is that if there is in fact some kind of biologic or genetic piece, that families with a history of substance use disorders are at more risk for substance use disorders. The reality, though, is that substance use disorders, including alcohol use disorders, do emerge in families when there is not a history of substance use disorders. And so there's some thinking that perhaps there are some differences between genetic/family histories of alcohol use disorders and non-family histories. And so some of those differences are both discussed in the chapter and highlighted here. Really, by definition, if somebody has more of a familial form of alcohol use disorder, then in part, first, it's characterized by the fact that there is a positive family history of those problems, and so we know the person's at more risk. If there is such a positive family history, then in general, those individuals have an earlier age of onset of the alcohol use disorder, and they tend to have more sort of complicated, problematic symptoms, destructive symptoms that is referred to here. So it really becomes more problematic at a younger age. It oftentimes is identified at an earlier age. These are individuals who are identified and come to treatment, in their teens, etc., even mid to late teens, early 20s. And it also doesn't appear to have a complication that puts them at greater risk for other psychiatric mental illnesses. And so at subsequent courses, you're going to hear about mesoamyleal substance abusers. For people who have this early onset familial form of alcohol use disorder, they don't appear to be at increased likelihood of other psychiatric complications. For those individuals who have a non-family history of substance use disorder, of alcohol use disorder, then when it emerges, then there appears to be both a later onset. This is disorders that emerge at a later age, and also they tend to be, quote, less problematic, less destructive, less virulent is the word they use here. And so individuals who don't have a family history tend to have not as complicated or not as problematic a symptom set as people with a family history. Before we move our attention then to the personality and psychological makeup of the host, the last comment that the author makes is a reference to an awareness of an emerging interest in the interaction between the genetic piece, the biologic piece that we have with us, and how that interacts with and can be influenced by the environment. There certainly is an awareness that you may have traits, you may have genetic conditions that are present that need to be, quote, activated. And so there is an awareness that the environment can at times turn, quote, what they call switches on or off, activate various things. And so there's an emerging awareness of and an emerging interest in the interaction between how the environment does influence, activate, turn on and off various genes and switches that can either increase or decrease the likelihood of the development of substance use disorders. So as we turn our attention to looking at the host, but from a personality / psychological makeup perspective, it's important to recognize a couple things. Early on, there was a perception and or a belief that in order to understand alcohol problems, that it really was in fact not a biologic condition, not a genetic condition, but in fact it was something that was a reflection of a problem in the person. And so the book does a nice job about talking about how early on there was the perception that there are people who have, quote, this alcoholic personality, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this chapter, as we go through the book. And also then sort of the idea that if in order to assess a person psychologically, that there is an agreement that we all have basic needs, we all have psychological needs, and that those needs must be, quote, met or satisfied if we're to survive and to be healthy and happy. And so sort of by extension, so therefore, if some of our needs are not met, then we're not full, we're not complete, and so the perception, and the author uses the terms, those unmet needs are known as, quote, holes or deficiencies or gaps. And so the idea is that if you have an unmet need, you have a hole somehow that needs to be filled. So continuing with that approach, then the idea was that if we were really going to understand people who have substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders, then what we needed to do is determine what it was, what were the gaps, what was missing, what were the holes that were present in their life that would allow us to understand and explain why they had this problem. And the thinking is that if you knew what the absences were, what the gaps were, what the holes were, then treatment would attempt to fill or to cover up those holes, and the person would no longer engage in these unhealthy behaviors. Obviously, it was done without an idea or an understanding that we have today about the role of genetics, of the biologic, of the biophysiologic, and it also excluded the environment in which we operated. And so both genetic and biologic components of the social environment were not considered as part of this early approach. And the other thing is that if the approach was based upon people who already were alcohol dependent, then it was using a sample population that already was experiencing the condition, and so perhaps it biased the earliest outcomes or the thinking on the topic. The author makes reference to one of the earliest theories that was applied to try to understand alcohol use disorders and alcohol dependence, i.e. the psychoanalytic theory, the theories of Sigmund Freud. Two things that they point out. Freud is the father of psychoanalysis, the father of insight-oriented therapy, and obviously a dominant figure in, quote, the helping field, with a very specific perception on what we needed to understand and look at to help people get better. And for Freud, it was the early childhood experiences. And so everything he perceived was somehow based upon the idea that there were early childhood experiences that were, quote, either incomplete or unsatisfying. And so therefore, in order to allow the person to become healthy, those early childhood gaps, deficiencies, unpleasant experiences had to be met. And so Freud came back to the idea that it was a problem that occurred in what he called the oral phase of development, accounted for the development of substance use disorder, alcoholism in particular. Freud didn't specifically address alcoholism, but his followers did. And so for many, many people, there was an attempt made to treat alcoholism or alcohol use disorders by focusing on insight-oriented therapy that addressed problems that they encountered during their oral development phase. this was extended by other folks who kind of followed Freud. One of those people was Alfred Adler, who saw characteristics that he called the experience of the feeling of dependency. And so Freud's work was sort of extended and modified by other people. It's described in the chapter. It's important, I think, to understand there are some initial attempts to understand this. In general today, there's not a lot of people who would use psychoanalytic theory as a way to understand alcohol dependence, but it's important to understand what the roots of the field were. The author then proceeds to categorize and review some of the current thinking that has followed earlier thoughts in terms of personality theories, and in particular identifies these here. Certainly there are theorists who would say that alcohol and substance use disorder is in fact a learned behavior, and that people acquire a substance use disorder because they experience positive results, and so therefore if it is a positive experience, they continue to engage in that behavior, and so the behavior changes because they continue to be exposed to use a substance. And you're going to hear and see some of this when we talk about impact on the brain. There's another approach that is actually more of a sort of a very simple pluses and minuses, pros and cons decision-making process. So it makes it a much more rational approach. Just says that there's an analysis that the person does, and when the positives outweigh the negatives, then the person will choose to continue with the positives. And so there are individuals who would conceptualize substance use disorders and decisions about continuing alcohol use as a very simple pros and cons perspective. There's also a discussion in the chapter about how individuals' beliefs, i.e. what we expect to happen, will then in fact influence our response. When people expect good things to happen, then they're more likely first to initiate and then continue to engage in that behavior. When people expect problems to occur, then they're less likely to initiate and continue that behavior. And so just an identification that there are expectations that we carry with us and that individuals carry with us that will influence their likeliness or the likelihood of them either engaging and continuing in alcohol use or other drug use, as well as taking a look at or put them at less risk of engaging in and continuing in substance use. And then they proceed to talk a little bit about looking at people from sort of a temperament perspective, more what are the qualities or traits that people have that either perhaps make them more or less likely to engage in substance use disorders. The concept of temperaments is described a little bit further in the chapter, that they're all traits that exist on a continuum, and so people are more or less a certain trait. People might be more or less impulsive. People might be more likely or less likely to engage in risky or non-risky behavior, etc. And so it's based upon the idea that there are spectrums that personality traits exist on, and that we can be categorized on a variety of these spectrums. And in particular, the chapter talks a little bit about the fact that there are these 6 structures here that might be related to either the likelihood, either increased or decreased risk of alcohol consumption and potential development of alcohol use disorders. So take a look at these and understand the concept that we all have certain characteristics, certain traits, and we can all be classified on how impulsive we are. Some of us are very impulsive. Some of us are much less impulsive, very unlikely to do impulsive things. Some of us like to find new events. We seek out new experiences. We're sensation seeking. Some of us tend to avoid new events. We're very cautious and don't engage in sensation seeking. So they do a nice job talking about how these traits can potentially influence the likelihood of us continuing to use, both using and continuing to use the substance. And then remember that from a public health perspective, the last sort of part of their 3-part assessment, first was the agent or alcohol itself, second was the host, and now third is the environment. And so we now turn our attention to the author's discussion about the environment. Certainly part of it is a recognition that we all live, every individual is part of and identifies with a specific culture. And so certainly the culture that you're a part of and your cultural orientation towards drinking are going to influence, again, likelihood of drinking, whether it increases or decreases the likelihood of drinking, the likelihood of engaging in the use of mood-altering substances, etc. So the author acknowledges that culture is an important factor as part of an environmental influence in people's decisions about the use of mood-altering substances. And they describe some different cultural attitudes towards drinking. And in this case, what you're going to see is that there are a range of attitudes towards drinking. Some cultures are specifically focused on abstinence, that you're not permitted to use alcohol in any form in that culture. Some it's restricted to ritualistic use, i.e. it is available, but it's used only during religious or formal ceremonies. It's not used across by all members of the culture, and in particular, it's not used in what is typically how it's used here in the United States for, quote, convivial or social use. In general, in Western culture and U.S. culture, alcohol is a common part of social occasions, social activities, and so there are people in our culture in the U.S. who certainly fall into any one of these four categories. But convivial use is a culture that basically encourages or permits alcohol consumption and permits it to be part of social occasions. And then they talk a little bit about cultures where it is used utilitarianly, and in particular it's used for not only personal reasons, but it's used for survival. And so take a look at how they describe cultural orientations towards drinking, especially if that last one, the utilitarian one, doesn't make sense to you. At times in the U.S., we talk a little bit about how other cultures approach alcohol consumption differently. What is it that, why do other cultures have either greater or lesser rates of problems of alcohol use disorders or alcohol dependence? And so the next couple of slides talk a little bit about that. When there are low rates of problems, i.e. low rates of problematic use, low rates of dependence, in general, those cultures, young people, children are gradually introduced to alcohol. There's a consistent parental behavior and attitude towards the use of alcohol. And there's also some sort of perceptions of alcohol that are actually described here. So it's considered to be something that's a regular part of life. It's not stylish, funny, or overconsumption is not tolerated. It's not considered a rite of passage. It's not considered that you only do it to be a certain age. It's not marketed or accepted as being a sign of power, potency, of virility, things like that. You're also not pressured to use, so abstinence is considered socially acceptable. And so it's not the dominant area of focus. It's really something that is a part of everyday life. It accompanies everyday life. In comparison, when you look at cultures where there are higher rates of problems or higher rates of alcohol use disorders, alcohol dependence, what we see is there is no universal or shared agreement upon how, when, why, and where people are permitted or allowed to drink, which means people have to make their own decisions about drinking. We also, if there's not clear, agreed upon rules, it's unclear whether or not you're sort of following along or violating cultural norms, cultural beliefs, things like that. Ultimately, there are risks associated with, quote, evaluating the behavior of the person based upon whether or not they are under the influence of alcohol. This all makes it much more unclear as to whether or not you're doing what's socially permitted, socially acceptable. So they talk here about, so therefore you see increases in ambivalence or uncertainty and confusion and potentially guilt about it. They also talk a little bit about, as people either negotiate two different cultures or move from one culture to another, then sometimes what you've done before is now very different. And so we see changes in first generation, second generation, where the cultural guidelines were very clear in one culture, and now they're not clear or 180 degrees opposite in this culture, all of which can lead to higher rates of alcohol problems. So the next couple slides talk about the evolution occurs when cultures are changing from sort of a isolated culture to becoming more and more a part of in particular, the Western world. And so this talks a little bit about sort of values or practices that are in place prior to or from the original culture. But as alcohol becomes a commodity in all cultures now, what happens, we see these changes continuing or generally emerging here. And so we see, increased promotion of alcohol consumption, commercial products, including beer, which is really very, very familiar to those of us who live here in the Western world. As a result, we also then see that they start to experience more problems. Traditional drinking patterns combined with current circumstances lead to problems, is how they refer to it here. And so cultures that change, oftentimes one of the changes that they have to wrestle with is the evolving and the changing attitudes towards and practices around alcohol consumption. They do a nice job just highlighting in the chapter that there are certain sort of patterns or styles, this is on page 130, that talk about that are more predictive of people having alcohol problems, and they're all listed here, and I think they're self-explanatory, but be familiar with these, because if you're a member of a culture or you see an individual who fits some of these patterns, some of these styles, then it would suggest that he or she is potentially going to be experiencing problems. This is the second piece about the sort of the problems or the behaviors in particular that correlate with the presence or the development of alcohol use disorders, alcohol problems. As we get ready to close out the chapter, they talk towards the end of it about so what has been attempted, what are the attempts, what's been tried as a way to limit or reduce problems relative to the consumption of alcohol, etc. And so you're going to see all these described in the last several pages of that chapter. I think this discussion begins on page 131, and you'll see all these things here in the United States. We've certainly passed laws to limit access to alcohol. We've increased the price. Taxing actually can be very effective because if you increase taxes, it reduces availability to young people in particular. So there's efforts to control alcohol consumption by looking at both pricing and tax structure. There's also evidence just to make alcohol available or restricted, available during certain hours, not available outside of certain hours. Also restrictions to where you can purchase it, alcohol licensing, things like that. And also, we've seen changes in regulation of advertising and practices. I mean, there's limits about where and how products can be advertised, where billboards can be placed. Illinois had an interesting history. At one point, they eliminated quote happy hour promotions, and the beverage industry and restaurateurs were successful at getting that elimination, that restriction eliminated. So you now can see happy hours. But there's a variety of legal attempts that people will use, which have greater and lesser levels of success at reducing or limiting access to alcohol. They also talk a little bit in the chapter about how you can do cross-cultural comparisons, but they're difficult because every age or every culture has different potential rules about ages to purchase. Obviously here in the U.S. in general it's 21, but in other parts of the world there is no such restriction on the age of purchase. So it really makes the ability to, for example, to look at law enforcement from a legal possession, a legal purchase act. You can't do those kinds of comparisons. Depending on where you are, those laws are not necessarily even enforced on a regular or on a predictable basis. Similarly, if you try to assess or compare cultures based upon drinking and driving offenses, you're going to have different rates of BAC that result in charges. In Illinois, it's 0.8 or 0.08, but in other states it could be different. Other parts of the world it could be different. Also, classification of penalties can be different as well. So as they talk about the challenges of cross-cultural comparisons, they ultimately will talk about the fact that it's difficult to do based upon inconsistencies, not as much in the United States, but with the U.S. and other parts of the world. cross-cultural in general would say that we're looking at how we compare to other parts of the world. As we get ready to close the chapter, take a look at, there's a nice little reference to this. It begins on page 138. Cultural influences, on recovery. Refers to sort of an observation made by an author named Greg Bateson, who really compares and contrasts sort of the Western and the Eastern cultural perspectives on individual and or culture, which also impacts on how we perceive problems relative to both alcohol use disorder, alcohol dependency, and what people need to do to get better. So it's an interesting discussion that he has there. It's an interesting sort of summary that ultimately sort of an argument that in order for people to get better, there has to be a change in his or her perception of the worldview of that person who's in trouble with alcohol. And so he talks about the fact that the Western sort of focus on the individual, strong, rugged individual, is something that can get in the way of helping people get better from alcohol use disorders and substance use disorder problems. These are some of the attempts, and in some respects, this is a little bit redundant from the couple of slides earlier. So certainly here in the United States, there are a number of things that we've done as a way to change or moderate people's drinking patterns, and you certainly see all these in place right now. Laws about alcohol use, i.e. Raising the legal drinking age, drinking in public, consumption in public, public intoxication, also lowering the standard for legal intoxication, DUI kinds of things. They make reference to community and state level organizations such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving and other groups like that, Students Against Drunk Driving, that have been developed and attempted to influence sort of attitudes towards alcohol consumption, and certainly just on a personal penalty level, i.e. that we've held people accountable if they provided alcohol or made alcohol available or permitted underage drinking, and so there's now legal liabilities that people experience, and actually that business owners will experience when death or injury occurs as a result of drinking. So there's clear evidence that we do some things here in the United States that most of us would be familiar with in an effort to moderate people's drinking patterns, all of which have some influence, but they're not perfect. And then the last piece in the book that they close with are some specific sort of suggestions or hints that will help reduce the risk of harm, alcohol-related risk. And so it's not a focus on knowing when to say no, it's knowing when to say yes to alcohol. We haven't talked yet about a harm reduction approach, but there is some recognition that people will use alcohol in particular, and so we may not have to focus on alcohol, on abstinence from alcohol. Perhaps the thing is that we therefore have to take a look at how to reduce the likelihood of harm, i.e. designated drivers, those kinds of decisions, don't drive when you're drunk, those kinds of things that are all efforts to reduce problems caused by alcohol. In many campuses, you'll see efforts to try to highlight the alcohol-related risk. I don't know that we've talked about it yet, but the risks that are associated with alcohol consumption, including risk of physical trauma, sexual victimization, things like that, and then also how we can use technology to reduce harm. And in the DUI treatment field, for example, there are devices, breath alcohol interlock devices, that at times people convicted of DUIs will need to install as an attempt to make sure that they're not driving under the influence. Like anything, it's not a perfect system, but we also continue to take a look at opportunities to use technology as a way to reduce the harm associated with alcohol consumption. So that's how the author concludes chapter 5. We'll have some questions on the discussion board about what causes alcohol use disorder, and actually substance use disorder will probably be a little bit more broad than that. But this gives you a summary of what we kind of know today, current information, current research about what causes alcohol use disorder, and really the interplay between the biologic or the physiologic or the genetic and the environment, the social environment. So keep this in mind as we move ahead, looking at diagnosing and treating alcohol use disorders and substance use disorders. Thanks so much. Keep up with the reading, and I look forward to hearing from you and interacting with you on the discussion board.